Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, panelists. Good evening to all our attendees and to our esteemed panelists. Thank you for joining us this evening for the second in our series DSB Digital Plus, entitled The IBDP and International Perspective. We're going to discuss some of the bigger picture issues surrounding the International Baccalaureate Diploma Programme. To set the scene, the IB Diploma Programme, founded in 1968, has grown to serve a huge global community. This year, 170,343 students in schools in 146 countries were entered for the IB, studying a dizzying array of 218 subjects. Students study the IBDP in schools of one or multiple nationalities. It is often perceived as elitist, and yet it is offered in academically non-selective schools and in both affordable private schools in India and elsewhere, and state schools in many countries, including the United States. It has clearly defined values which put the development of the whole learner as a global citizen at the very heart of its lofty aspirations, and it promotes itself as the preeminent preparatory course for universities globally, a position supported by many external authorities. All this raises some important and interesting questions. Does learning and an international community of staff and students materially affect the student's experience, and how well the IB's goals are realized? Are the values it promotes truly international or fundamentally Western? To what extent is the commitment to international mindedness realized or even understood across the spectrum of schools? And to what extent is this helped or hindered by the curriculum? And is the IB Diploma Programme truly the best preparation for students to study at university and for their life afterwards? So to help me discuss some of these questions, we have a range of panelists who I would like now to introduce and to thank again for agreeing to join us this evening. Firstly, let me introduce Richard Bartlett. Richard is the principal of DSB International School. Prior to this, he spent 20 years as principal, head of IB World Schools in Germany and Turkey, and has also taught IBDP English and Theory of Knowledge. His school in Berlin was the first in the world to run all 4 IB programs. He has his own educational consultancy and is an accredited assessor for both the Council of International Schools and Council of British Schools. He has also taught in other Asian countries such as Brunei and is currently awaiting his visa to India, staying on the idyllic Isle of Wight. Secondly, let me introduce Amog Desai. Amog completed his ICSE board examinations at St Mary's School, one of the most established boys' schools in Mumbai, in 2014, and then joined DSB in our first cohort for the IB programme. He then studied an LLB degree at the University of Warwick, which he completed in July, and he is now set to join the University of Bournemouth for the legal practice course in October. He remains closely connected to the school as his younger brother is currently studying here. Frank Bracha is the founding head of school for Goldcrest International, an IBDP school in Navi Mumbai, and he has been in India since 2011. His international teaching career started in 1991, and he has been in IB schools since 1994, having worked in Syria, Finland, Germany, Vietnam, Azerbaijan, Brunei, Grand Cayman, Norway, and India. He is a native of the United States and holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from Temple University, as well as a Master's of Education from Antioch University. He has taught IBDP Economics, IBDP History, IB Theory of Knowledge, and MYP Humanities, and has been in school administration for 20 years. Frank is an IB visiting school team member, assisting schools in the IB authorization process, as well as workshop leader running workshops for young teachers and school administrators. He also serves as chair for the IB Heads Association Western Division, covering Maharashtra and Gujarat, and has been the vice president of the India IB Heads Association since 2019. Then may I introduce Junie Mitchell. Before joining DSB as a learning leader for humanities, Junie Mitchell taught IB, UK and US curricula across 4 continents. She has been an examiner for the IBO for 9 years. She believes in the transformative nature of education. This means that learning should challenge students to think critically and abstractly to construct their own meaning. Additionally, education should provide students with the skills necessary to effectively navigate the world outside the classroom. Junie holds a Master's of Education in Curriculum and Instruction and is pursuing a Master's in Educational Leadership. Then may I introduce Catherine Fox. Catherine Fox is currently IBWS Manager, IB World Schools Manager, after she joined the IB as DP Schools Service Manager in 2014. She supports a portfolio of authorized IB World Schools offering the primary years program, middle years program, diploma program, and career-related program in 41 different countries. Catherine has extensive experience of IB program implementation in state schools, semi-state schools, and private schools, as well as in different cultural contexts and school communities. She gathered this in her current role and in various professional roles as a school leader, teacher, consultant, IBDP examiner, co-author, and school visitor. She also works with government bodies, for example, with educational authorities in Germany and Russia. She has lived and worked in Germany, Great Britain, New Zealand, and the Netherlands, and has traveled extensively. Then finally, may I introduce Neha Budia. Neha is an alumnus of DSB International School, having completed the IBDP in 2019. During her time at DSB, Neha founded TEDx DSB International School and was actively involved in debate, Model United Nations, and the Student Council. Neha currently studies biochemical engineering at University College London, studying the transformation of discoveries in the life sciences into tangible and scalable products such as vaccines, regenerative medicines, and biofuels. She is currently the president of the University College of London Engineering Society, the largest STEM society in the university. With an interest in starting a career in investment banking, Neha is excited by the growth potential biotechnology and healthcare hold. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My first question is to Frank and also to Richard, and that is, the IB is strongly committed to developing students with the features of the learner profile, including becoming global citizens. How successfully do you feel this has been implemented in different schools that you have run? So I wonder if, Frank, you would like to start that off, and then perhaps hand over to Richard.
Frank, you need to put your microphone on.
Thank you. It is a vast question. And I think when you start to talk about the learner profile, you've got to put it aside and look at it as a one cohesive set of ideas. The goal of it really is to promote student agency, to make students independent. In addition to that, the concept of internationalism in the IB context means international mindedness, which simply means to be aware of the world around you. That becomes very important. In schools I've worked in, many have been international schools, so the students came from various backgrounds. But that doesn't necessarily promote internationalism because people come with their own ideals of their own country. And especially many international schools could be terribly Anglocentric, meaning all the students are basically native English speakers. And so internationalism needs to be built in that community also. In some IB schools I've worked in, especially in one in India, we're mono-national. I mean, almost all of the students are coming from an Indian background. However, the nature of the IB through its curriculum and through its choices of curriculum and through its sense of inquiry, not just in the diploma, but you see that also specifically in MYP and PYP, that sense of inquiry does promote and in subject selection in terms of content of the subjects in the DP, does promote an international view of the subjects. I think if you try to build internationalism in an IB school, you know, with an axe in your hand, just trying to pound it into people's heads, that's also very, very silly. But it should come out of a natural aspect of the CAS and of the curriculum. When you have a school in which you have 30 or 50 different nationalities and you're in a different country than most of the nationalities, it becomes easier to build that concept of international understanding. But you've got to realize that most IB diploma schools in the world are mononational. The vast majority of IB diploma students are US, Canadian, and American citizens doing the program in their own countries, in which basically everyone's from the same country. So internationalism is often built really through the curriculum and through inquiry. I know that sounds a bit general, but it truly is. That's just some opening thoughts. I hope that's made sense.
Thank you very much, Frank. Richard, what are your feelings in terms of how to develop the international values of the IB and the IB learner profile within different international schools that you've worked?
I can just only refer to a couple of international schools too that I've specifically worked in and look at the learner profile of the IB, and there's nothing in that learner profile that I think is actually particularly and only international. The learner profile fits perfectly well with any other system in the world, I would say. So if the students are knowledgeable, they're thinkers, they're communicative, principled, caring, risk takers, balanced and reflective, well, that's enough. We don't need any more actually to be international. And having worked in one school with 67 nationalities and head of the school with one nationality in Turkey, I can say that it's, if you aim to reach the learner profile or get the students to develop that profile in themselves, it doesn't really matter where they come from in the slightest. And part of the original question was how successful is it? And that depends a lot, I think, on the families and the students themselves. If the families and the students are reaching out because they want to be like that, that's the profile that they want to develop in themselves and their family, then we will be successful. In the minority of cases, it's definitely the case that families and students might choose the school and IB program for another reason, maybe as an entrance to university ticket. And frankly, then it's less successful. That the students might get to university, that's true, and maybe one of their choice. But as a person, a lifelong learner, I'm less certain as to whether they are successful than in the case of those that are genuinely embracing the principles behind the IB. Whatever passport they have, totally irrelevant.
Okay, thank you very much. Really sort of helpful starting point. So clearly, I think just to reflect back, do you feel that the raw material is there in the learner profile and in the guidance around IB education, but it's somewhat more nuanced as to how successfully that actually transfers into the learning of individuals, and it is actually the individual's learning journey that is crucial here. And so that's a good place for us to start in thinking about how we can affect the effectiveness of that learning journey. So thank you very much. So moving on, good evening, Catherine. This question is for you and really looks, I'm asking you from the perspective of the IB as an organization. What does the IB value most about its international identity? And currently, what conversations are being had about how this can be developed in terms of international mindedness and intercultural competence, having just been told that we shouldn't be bashed over the head by these things?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Generally, I mean, I think in some ways, you know, the aspects that Richard and Frank have mentioned, the aspect of community combined with education through curricula, because I think you go into education because you believe that intentionally you can make a difference, that it isn't enough to just bring communities together, but that you actually then come with a purpose. And I think the IB mission is that kind of purpose that we all kind of commit to. And if I'm looking at, you know, the schools, I mean, you already, Howard, mentioned the number of schools, the diversity of schools that actually commit. They commit because of that mission to create a peaceful world. So I think if I'm talking about what the IB values, I think I mean, I don't want to kind of, you know, do a hit list, but I really want to show a systems approach that actually kind of shows that basically the interdependence of community, and that can be, and that community comes with dispositions. That is a community of IB learners. I think, you know, the power of the community that Richard is referring to, that really engages with that learner profile, with that mission, with the kind of education that Frank so well kind of shows, with the inquiry that is in every program, with the kind of international curriculum through global contexts that research shows is so powerful in deliberately bringing and contextualizing an open-mindedness. And that then actually, and the programs in themselves that are constructed with multilingualism, with so a focus on different languages in order to give engagement with culture, global contexts that are so powerful. For example, think about the way that, you know, and agency. I mean, Frank mentioned that already, that actually it is intentional that these elements are given to schools. And I think it's I think the IB values also the partnership with the schools. That actually deliberately, the IB does not run schools. The IB is an educational organization providing programs and providing standards and a mission to schools, partners with the schools through evaluation to actually look at the wider context of an IB education. And at the same time also is mindful that it is the school that contextualizes the international mindedness within its community. I mean, I mean, for me, it's a privilege to work with so many schools in so many different contexts. And I mean, working with schools that bring international mindedness into a context where students have not traveled, but might be very, very diverse in their cultural backgrounds. But they might not be that international expat community that we often associate with that IB, really highlights what the mission is about, really highlights that it is that curiosity that an inquirer brings to the person that they socially construct meaning with. And that, I think, is what the IB values, that constant dialogue that communities have with the IB, and that the IB community, through the professional development that we expect educators to engage in, the conferences, the events, the evaluation, the digital platforms that are there for a community to engage with each other, that all in its, as a package, as a whole, really brings it to the learner, constructs it around the learner, gives it to the whole learning community, and then actually really kind of embeds it in the programs. And here I want to be really specific because I've already talked about agency, and Frank already mentioned CAS and the service learning that we have in every single program. A student as young as 4 in an IB program has a service element as part of their learning. And we do I mean, I think if you're talking about the how is that developed? And I go back to the deliberate development. I think it's very important to build on what Richard said with the lifelong learners, that from a young age, you make a young person understand and act. And in that aspect, I think that is what we need as internationally minded people. We need people that believe that they can make a change in that world, and that we do give them a kind of education that on a daily basis shows them through the curriculum, but also through their teachers role modeling it, that there is that openness, that there is that agency, and that there is that engagement of that global engagement. And I think in that sense, you know, if you ask me how does IB do it, I think it does it with its schools and through its schools. And yeah, I think we really value the richness that comes with the contextual implementation of IB education, in particular in schools, in groups of schools, in schools connecting locally, but also schools internationally exchanging, and IB education also working within national contexts where there is a clear, deliberate decision for that IB education to enrich through the pedagogy and through the values that come in the learner profile, and at its core with the mission, the belief that together and by understanding the interdependence of our action, of our dependency on each other, that we can make a difference and create a peaceful world.
Thank you very much. You made so many points there that I'm going to struggle to reflect back on them, but I guess the overall thing is that you're talking about a very holistic educational program that brings together all these different skills. And if you are the various skills of the IB learner profile, then almost by default, working within this global community, you are going to develop international mindedness. You've got the tools to really begin to understand the world around you. And it will be interesting to hear, talking to some of our young IB learners, to what extent they feel that already, to what extent that is really real. I do think that your focus on CAS there in the answer was, for me, very powerful, because I do think it's a marvelous part of the IB program. And also for you to recognize, for us to recognize that diversity doesn't just mean many different nations, and even certainly in our country here in India, diversity amongst our people is a very, very important part of who we are. So thank you very much for that, Catherine. I should come back to you a bit later on with another question. I'd like now to turn to Junie. And now we're going to go from the global overlook to sort of like hone in on classroom and curriculum. So Junie, as a teacher of history, which is both very important and consequently a controversial subject in many countries, how do you feel development of the history curriculum reflects the IB principles, and what more do you think is needed to contribute to this development of global citizens?
So one of the first things that I want to say is I think the IB is just amazing. So prior to teaching IB, I taught history in American and British schools. And it's very nationalistic, and it's also, it doesn't challenge students to think. And when I started teaching the IB, the constructivist nature of it was just amazing, because that is what you want, and that's what we're taught to do when you learn to be a teacher. And this is what you do at university when you do history, which is vastly different than normally how history is taught in national classrooms. But, and I think that the IB curriculum is really amazing in that it is really broad. And, you know, as a history teacher, you can teach almost anything you want, because what's really important is that students engage with the process of doing history and all of this skill development and thinking and stuff like this that it provides students with the opportunity to engage in. But here's my but. What I realized is that as I taught history more, as I met more history teachers, the vast majority of the people that I met teaching history in the DP were Westerners, myself included, and it kind of like I'm a little bit different in that being a minority from the U.S., I live in two worlds. Right? There's the majority culture, and then there is the minority culture that I have to, or the majority culture that I have to engage in, and sometimes reject. Right? But so what I realized is what I started thinking about is, was I doing to my students what my history teachers did to me as a minority and person of color in the US? So I've taught in a number of countries in which they are mononational schools. The students are largely Vietnamese, or the students are largely Romanian. So when I'm teaching history, what perspective am I giving them? Now, of course, the IB encourages the students to develop their own ways of thinking. But what am I shaping? So these are just kind of some of the things that I ask myself. And then the other thing, and why history is so controversial, of course, is because history is important to nation building. History is important to identity formation. It's one of the glues that holds a people together. And especially if you have a multicultural country, that history really is important in the binding. And it's one of the things that I often spoke to my students about when they're sitting through my class, and I'm teaching them history, and I'm teaching them sort of like a certain way to approach history. What is happening to their identity formation? Are they being alienated from the rest of their people? Now, Katrin talked about this IB community of learners, and it's really amazing. A group of people who become your people, and you have a certain way of looking at the world, which is awesome, and which is kind of what growing up in your own community would provide you, a lens through which to interpret and engage with the world. But I also wonder, is that enough for students? And that's something that maybe our former student panelists can address. And the reason why I wonder if it's enough is because that connection to your community, to your nation, to your culture, your people, provides you with resilience in dealing with a world that may not embrace you. And this is especially important when I am teaching history in places like India or Vietnam or Sudan. And so if history is important to the identity formation, and I'm teaching them a history that kind of disrupts the continuity to their culture and their people, is the IB community going to be enough to provide them with the resilience when they go out and engage in that majority culture world that is very much rooted in the West? And so one of the things that I think, just to wrap it up, is that it is probably really important that schools think about this, because it's not just history, because the IB isn't just one subject. The IB is holistic. It's this entire world, in a way, that we are presenting students, that it may be really vital for schools to contemplate this, and also consciously engage in helping students to be rooted in both.
Thank you very much. I think, you summed up better than I could. So I'm going to leave your summing up. I think it's also very interesting because our two students, ex-students that we have with us, were both very, very enthusiastic history learners. So perhaps Neha and Amog, can I turn to you now, and I'm going to throw you a curveball, because I'm going to throw you a question that I wasn't going to ask you. But history learning, you were both enthusiastic history learners. Neha and Amog, what do you reflect on what history gave you as a subject? And obviously you're coming from two slightly different perspectives, Amog as an Indian and Neha as a British person. So Neha, would you like to just sort of answer that one? Apologies for throwing something straight at you.
No worries. Well, I think it's a great question, highly pertinent in today's age where, other histories we're reflecting on is a
Can you shout slightly louder?
Yes, and it is a reflection of our identity and who we are. So studying history, the main modules that we took were rather westernized history, so German and Russian focus. I think that, yes, there was an aspect that, yes, we are studying in India. We could have studied so much of the history that we were doing. But what I took from history was mainly the raw skills. And I think, as with most of the things in the IB, is there is the knowledge, there is the book aspect of it, but then there's also the skills which you learn to analyze, which you learn to synthesize, which you learn to reason. So I think having completed the DP and having studied these certain modules of history, I think I have the skills to go ahead and apply it to a different area. The fact that we can evaluate different sources, we can look at it from different perspectives, having that perspective building aspect rooted within your mind. I think applying that to different areas of knowledge is something that we can always do. And I think once you have that base, that foundation, you can go on to do many other things from that.
Thank you very much. Very much reflecting what some of our earlier speakers said about the core skills being the foundation on which you build this development. Amog, again, you were a keen history student. How do you feel about this particular subject?
Well, I think it's actually really important. Coming from an Indian background, we pretty much have a prescribed textbook, and we were led to believe that what was in the textbook was correct when that was necessarily not the case. So coming to the IB and studying history at a higher level was obvious. Analysis became a very, very important aspect in order to do well. So you had to compare different perspectives. You know, you could argue it from different ways, and there was not necessarily one right answer. As long as you could back up your viewpoint with facts, you know, you could make a pertinent argument. And I think that skill you can take on and apply it in other aspects of life outside the classroom, most importantly. So as a subject, you know, people could argue that what's history is history, but the skill set that you acquire from history, studying it at the IB, I think it's highly important because, as Nia said, you can apply it to different aspects of life inside and outside the classroom.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Amog. So now questions that I was specifically planning to aim at the pair of you. So I want you to reflect a bit about what you personally felt, and I think you've done that already in some of your answers. Whether you'd like to add any more to how you feel the IB prepared you for life after school, and do you get any sense, studying as you have with students from all over the world and students from different programs, what are the things that you feel that you got from the DSB, from the IB, that stand out? I mean, particularly in your case, Amog, of course, having spent a lot of time in the Indian education system, you're able to make quite a sort of close comparison of school systems. So, Amog, would you like to sort of carry on with that then, in terms of what you feel the IB gave to you, and how you can tell that?
Ooh, what the IB gave to me, I think we'll be here all night. But just to summarize, like I said before, you know, as the Indian education, as far as the 12th grade, is concerned with more rote learning, you know, memory. Intelligence is determined by how much you can remember and how much you can parrot it out in your exam paper. It doesn't really encourage analytical thinking, critical thinking, different perspectives. There's a prescribed textbook, and you're supposed to memorize that. So coming to the IB, I had to completely change my entire way of thinking, especially with the whole analysis and critical thinking bit, because coming into the IB, I did not have that particular skill set. And reflecting back, having just completed my degree, if I continued with the Indian system, done the 11th, 12th, say the HSC, the higher secondary certificate, I don't think I would have done particularly well at university. I would have found it very overwhelming. So the different aspects of the IB, as it's been mentioned, it's a very holistic program. You've got theory of knowledge that encourages you to question everything that you've learned, English, history, that encourages you to have different perspectives, argue it from two different viewpoints. Was very crucial for me, especially with the degree I had chosen. So, yeah, that's about it.
Thank you very much, Amog. Thanks a lot for that. Neha, obviously you basically spent your entire life either in the British or in the international education system. Now back studying in the UK, do you think the IB has brought you anything that perhaps non-IB students don't have? And what are the things that you value most from your time as an IB student?
So I feel very fortunate to have studied the IB program, particularly at DSB. I think that's for a number of reasons. The IB is a very holistic program, as has been said. But I think breaking that down, what does it mean to be holistic? I think walking away from the IB diploma, having completed it, it helps you develop a well-formed mind as opposed to a well-filled mind. And with that focus at hand, I think it really equips you to solve some of the best problems or some of the largest problems that the world is facing, and to do so and also to compete on a global scale. So I think when you get to uni, you realize the level of competition that's out there. You realize when you graduate, when you want to succeed in your degree, it's not just about bringing one thing to the table. It's about bringing an array of things. It's about bringing outstanding communication skills. It's about being a leader. It's about being a team player and so many other things. But having empathy and awareness of those in your immediate context and those in a larger context. So being able to bring all these different aspects together and to really sympathize them gives you the cutting edge to solve these issues that we're facing, and to have an idea on how to work together with so many different people from different backgrounds. When we're seeing so much about diversity and the implications of diversity on things like innovation, on solving these issues, it really does enable you to fit into different contexts outside the one which you may directly have been from, and to do so and thrive in these situations. That's really been my experience. And I do think in terms of preparing you for university, the challenges that you face academically, but also the challenges when it comes to seeking employment and internships, it does give you the edge. Things like CAS, like has been mentioned before, it gives you the opportunity to act locally in your neighborhoods, in your areas, but also to keep that in mind and apply that to a global scale when you're at uni or when you're outside of your degree as well. So I think that's the biggest takeaways that I've had from the program.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask you a little sneaky question. Obviously I invited you on here because you were an outstanding student and I knew you would say outstanding things. How well do you think this worked for all the other people in the school? Do you think everybody took away something valuable from it? Or do you think some of them, it went over their heads and they might as well have been anywhere else?
I think the main thing, and this isn't IBDP specific, it's pretty much anything. If you're doing A-levels, if you're doing any other curriculum, if you're at university, if you're in a job, it's what you give to the program. And I'm a firm believer in you get as much out of what you put in. So if you do engage with the IB in the way that it's intended, that you dive deeply into your subjects, you try and find a passion in what you're doing, you try and find an interest, you try and seek relevance and significance in what is given and what is taught, then I do think that you have the best opportunities of seeking the most out there. I think if you see it as a burden, if you see it as I want to study one subject so I don't need the other 5, that is when you fall into the trap of not giving it your all. And I think that limits what you gain out of the program.
Thank you very much for that. I need to hasten on fairly quickly. If attendees would like to ask some questions to our panelists, please feel free to write them into the Q&A at the bottom of the page. And then hopefully I'll be able to get to some in a little while. So next I'd like to ask this question to Richard. I think perhaps you may have answered this already, so I'm just going to try and reword it. I'll come back to you when I've thought of a slightly different question. But perhaps if I can go to Catherine, from your global perspective, in which areas is the work needed most to make the IB truly successful in developing internationally understood set of values in its schools? If you could give one piece of information which you think would really raise the bar yet further in terms of developing international mindedness, what do you think it might be? And perhaps if I can also ask Frank and Richard that question as well afterwards, because I think you answered my second question in the first question.
I always love these $1 million questions. What is the one thing?
Yeah, okay. It's a bit harsh of me, I'm sorry.
And you know, actually, I mean, for me, it's that the hardest work is always keeping at it. And I think that is what it needs. And I mean, if I think about the capacity to reflect that we have in the IB community, and I mean, if I'm, you know, like even like in today's discussion, I mean, I'm listening to Junie, and I mean, the way that she actually triggered my thinking in terms of the resilience to actually bring what, as an IB community, we can all nicely nod to into the wider world, where IB is a tiny bit of education in between a landscape of national programs that are, like, if you compare the number of IB graduates with the number of graduates across the world, it's a drop in the ocean, and we still firmly believe that we have a real purpose to serve a global community that includes everyone. And I think the IB's work on inclusion, the IB's work on agency, the IB's work on discourse are just kind of examples of the most important thing, and that is never to become complacent. I mean, we've been around 50 years. I think there is a lot of things that we want to get better at. And I mean, if I'm thinking about, students coming to the IB seeking to make that difference, I mean, I think that's the best thing about being in education, that you don't have to solve everything, but you can also sow seeds and then trust the next one to take it a bit further. And in that respect, I know that, the IB has also kind of commissioned research into, well, what is it in schools that have a very strong commitment profile to promote international mindedness? What do these schools do differently than other schools?
Yeah.
Really kind of in line with the intentionality that I think is so vital if you want to actually see that there is a difference. And it is that they keep discussing to create shared agreement, and that it is deliberately, I'm not talking defining because that almost has a feeling of finite. I'm talking about agreeing, understanding, and that's, again, like somebody already mentioned, social constructivism, which is, at the heart of IB education. And doing that with the community and with the wider community, I think is constant work. And if you want the one and only thing, I think it's really kind of that keeping at it. I can see you nodding, Howard. I think you want to get.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and yes, and of course it's not just one thing, but that persistent, that consistent flow of reflection, discussion, our interconnectedness as a community, and looking into that community for those ideas, looking outside of that community for ideas. I think, yes, wonderful.
And turning it into action. I think really kind of connecting it back to that agency.
Yeah, yes, turning things into action is always important. I quite agree. So, Richard, if you were to sort of, again, to look at one particular area you think needs to be focused on most to drive forward the development of the IB ideals, and what do you think that might be?
I'm going to cheat and kind of answer that in two different ways.
First of all,
I think the IB should really have the spine to actually stick completely to its belief, to its mission, and not worry too much about what the rest of the world thinks, or engaging in places where it's not wanted, not asked for, or not currently useful. So sticking to the learner profile genuinely, which is, I'm afraid, unashamedly Western in some ways, but I think if it does that mainly, then it will be a better program. But the main thing is really why I became a teacher 40 years ago. Before I even thought of it, I'd read a book by Postman and Weingarten. I think they were Canadian authors, called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. And basically the whole thesis of the book was the purpose of education is to give kids a built-in crap detector. So if someone's talking crap, you should be able to detect it and do something about it. And I think the IB is the best program in the world to do that at the moment.
And that is supremely important in this world of fake news, disinformation, and mindless social media commentary. So yes, I think that's a pretty strong message. And if our students, and I think Neha and Amok are probably pretty good at that, I think we've achieved something. Frank, I'm going to sort of like, please will you give me your thoughts in this area as well?
Well, I'd have to say this, that if you look at the world around us and where we are now, the early stage of the 21st century, with so much reaction and regression in so many areas around the world, people returning to almost a 19th century sense of nationalism, which is extremely misplaced in the world today. I think there has never been a greater need for the International Baccalaureate than there is right now, to be totally honest. The IB, you have to realize, I mean, realistically speaking, the IB was an Anglo-centric and Anglo-American, it was a British-American invention. Most of all of the founding forces from the great Gus Hahn and all were all Caucasian Europeans or Americans. But they were the liberals of their age, of course. And we need to see the IB continue to develop, to embrace a truly global understanding, you know, and you're seeing that. I mean, I remember what the IB offices were like in the early 90s and what they're like now. So you see that change. You see that change in the way the curriculums are being developed. You talked about history. I mean, you could still do history purely Anglo-centric if you want to, but they've put enough in there, fortunately, and in all the curriculums to do that. But there really is that need for the IB to be the promoter and stick to what it wants to do. I think the changes in the standards and practices, I think it may take schools a few years to understand what they're actually trying to do. But what they're trying to do is create school agency, where schools have the independence to take their own roadway to where the IB is. The IB, after all, is a roadmap, but it's not going to work unless you know where you want to go. So, there's criticism recently of the IB. Of course, there's going to be criticism from all sources. But I do believe we've never needed the IB more than we need in the year 2020. That really is how I feel.
Thank you very much for that, Frank. And yeah, I mean, of course, people should understand that you are supposed to bring your own interpretation and your own vision to it as well within each school. Junie, some final thoughts on this before we turn over to some questions?
Final thoughts on the IB moving forward and globally. Yes, I think that since I started teaching the IB, certainly the curriculum has become more open. The questions, the organization, so that students, it's not based, the history that students are required to learn is not based only on what's happening in the Eurocentric world. Where I think that, and this is also myself included, where I think that what happens is there's a gap between what the IB has done in terms of creating this really expansive curriculum that can be tailored to any culture and country, and teachers. So they've really expanded what can be taught, but the teachers haven't necessarily expanded what they can teach. And that is for me as well. Like, you know, for me, I think how wonderful it is now that I live in India to be able to deliver more units that are based in South Asia, so that students can see where this fits into the rest of the world in terms of the history. And also so that students can have the opportunity to kind of apply this thinking that we're trying to get them to do in a more personal context, because sometimes that's our blind spot, right? We can analyze everything that's over there, But when it's very close to home, it becomes a little harder to do. So that also is school based, as you guys were saying. This idea of schools choosing and deciding where to go. Maybe that's what needs to happen as well. Is schools encouraging the teachers to utilize all that the IB offers in terms of the curriculum, and to incorporate more that is relevant to students' lives.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So I'm just going to turn over to some people's questions. I think it's worth saying when we talk about these values of the IB, and we have recognized that they are quite Eurocentric. If you look at the most recent Indian Education Act published only a few weeks ago, much of what the IB is saying about good education is reflected in the Indian Education Act. And so I think there's an increasingly common understanding that good education is good education. And I think we can proudly say that. And so, yes, I think the message from the panel, I hope you don't mind me summarizing, is clearly keep going at it, IB, keep pushing forward. Amogan Nehal, was there any final comment you wanted to make before I ask the questions?
No comment from me.
Okay, thank you. So actually, looking at the questions, the very first one, actually, Amog, you are the perfect person to answer this. Would it be an easy transition from the ICSE Indian board to the IB program?
I guess a simple answer to that would be no. It is quite a difficult transition. But that being said, there are a few caveats to that. I think the longer you've been exposed to the Indian way of learning, the longer it would take for you to adapt to what is required from the IB. So for me personally, I spent 11 years at St. Mary's. So for 11 years, I had been exposed to rote learning with no critical thinking whatsoever. So when I came to the IB, I did struggle a lot in my first year, not necessarily with the curriculum and that I couldn't understand what was being taught, but that I was struggling to adapt to the way of thinking that was required by the IB in order to get the most from the program. So for example, history and English in my first year were my two weakest subjects, because while I thought I was doing what was required by the teachers in terms of analyzing the poems or writing an analytical essay, it was rather like retelling a story, which was not required. So it did take me a year to adapt. But I would just like to say that I do not use my experience or my answer as a reference point, because students do adapt at different rates. You know, maybe I took a year to adapt to the IB, but that would not necessarily be true to someone else. That student might take longer, or he might even take shorter to adapt. So while there will be an element of difficulty at some point, how long that will last, that honestly depends on the student himself.
Thank you very much, Amog. And of course, I think it's also fair to say that you were starting in a school where most of the teachers had never experienced having to help a student transition. And our experience is now, and based on having used you as a guinea pig, that we are now much better at helping students to make this transition from the ICSE Indian board. And that would be true of many schools in this city, where people are used to it and know what the students need to make that transition. This second question is very, very definitely for Frank. In a developing country, how would this fee structure charged by the school to help education grow justify to all the richness imparted by the board? The reflection into this is important. So I think possibly what the questioner is asking is, often the IB is quite expensive, and you know, what as somebody who runs a school where you do offer the IB at a very, very reasonable price, can you talk a bit about the challenges around that?
Well, I think these are in any context of any country. But if you're running an international school in India, the fees to deliver the international baccalaureate program are going to be far more expensive for a school than a local board, because there is not only the annual fee you have to pay to the IB, there's the teacher training, and teacher training in an IB context will cost 4 to 7 times more than it would if you were training teachers for CBSE or ICSE. So you do have that. You also have to hire a teacher that would be able to understand and deliver the IB. So of course, basically all of the costs become higher. That being said, in an Indian context, it becomes very difficult to offer the IB at, say, the rate of an ICSE school, although I do know PYP schools that are actually do have relatively reasonable rates. Our school has a reasonable rate, but we're run by a charitable trust. And so our costs are to an extent offset by our charitable trust. And so that becomes very important. Also in our context, we do hire almost entirely local staff, which does give us more freedom in terms of salaries, and also gives us more opportunities to develop those teachers. I find that young Indian teachers are extremely energetic, and they want to learn and they want to develop, and I think that, you know, that can be very beneficial for a school. So, you know, you have to realize that there are some fee needs to run an IB school, and you know, it isn't, you know, if you look at the marginal cost of delivering an IB program to an IB diploma student, or even an MYP or PYP student, as opposed to doing a local board in Indian context or a Malaysian context, to do a local board, it would probably be 5 to 6 times higher. I would just guess 5 to 6 times higher marginally, because of the various costs to deliver and maintain. You've got to realize the IB goes through a rigorous process to authorize schools, and then does that every 5 years. So, you know, the school must continuously invest in its capital, the capital being the teachers and the capital being the needs of the school. Though the requirements for the science labs are head and shoulders above what would be a science lab in a CBSE or an ICSE school. So there are. But again, funding questions have a lot to do with the community and the group that runs the school, the parents, and how much people are willing to fund and sort of things like that. But they can be more affordable. But you can't run an IB school at 10,000 rupees a year. That's going to be very difficult.
No, thank you very much for that, Frank. Just one final question to Julie, and this is very specific about history. How much of the IB history curriculum incorporates national history? Is there any guidance to that, or does it depend on the school?
This really depends on the school. The way that, unlike other subjects, the way that the history curriculum is organized, the IB recognizes that the curriculum is being implemented in a range of countries. And so the categories are really broad. The case studies that you can use to meet the requirements are anything. The sky's the limit. So you can use nationally specific or culturally specific examples, as long as they're taught in an IB way, and as long as you're developing the skills and the abilities of the students. The problem comes in less with the curriculum itself and more with implementation. And that for myself, you know, I'm a Westerner, I'm Western educated, and so I have interests in, say, Africa and mostly East Asia. So when I teach, I can teach American stuff, I can teach European stuff, I can teach East Asian stuff. But here I am in India, and I, for example, do not have the depth of knowledge to be able to do Indian history justice in an IB way. That's really what it's about. What the IB is requiring, the IB requires me to teach this, to present and help the students develop the skills of a historian. And that means that I must have deep knowledge to be able to present them with different historical perspectives. Not just, here, memorize this, this is the history, this is the truth. And so if I lack that ability, then I cannot present it to the students. So then as we were saying earlier, it probably falls onto the school to hire people who have better knowledge of local history and then can deliver it in an IB way. Or like maybe in Frank's school, it's very possible that his teachers are delivering more South Asian history in an IB context, or to provide training for teachers so that they can develop that deep knowledge to be able to do it justice.
Thank you very much. Lovely answer. Yes, it takes a long time to learn Indian history. There's a lot of it. Richard, I'd just like to aim this one at you. I would happily answer it myself, but as a fellow British person, for a bright student wanting to pursue only a few range of subjects, say further maths and physics, can she be equally served by the EIB as they are by A-levels? I would deconstruct the question, but you know where we're going with that one.
If they truly only want to know maths, further maths and a bit more maths, and that is their one objective in life, then they are better off doing the A-levels. There's no doubt about that. If they want to include on the way to learning a lot about maths, further maths and a lot more maths, a great education and a wider world perspective, and actually make a useful contribution to society perhaps in the future, then they're probably better off choosing the IB. But it's horses for courses is the bottom. It depends what you want to get out of your education, or if it's families choosing what the families are hoping for. It's not going to be the same answer for everyone. The IB is not perfect for every single kid in the world, I don't think, but it could be for an awful lot of them.
Thank you. I'd also like to say that A-levels are obviously much narrower. If you have only a very, very limited possibility of reaching a high achievement in some subjects, an A-level course may seem better, but if you're very bright, then you can do all of these things and grow as a human being. And you have hopefully another 70 years to specialize in lots of areas that come thereafter. So I don't know if you would nod and agree with that, Neha? Okay, so slightly overrun by 3 minutes. Thank you very, very much for our panelists for your very succinct, very meaningful answers. It has been a real pleasure having this evening's meeting. Been lovely listening to everybody, lovely seeing everybody, meeting some old familiar faces along the way. And thank you very much to our attendees, and thank you for some very helpful questions at the end. This recording will be available on the school Facebook channel in the next few days once we've got it sorted out. So I would just like to bid you all a very good evening, and thank you very much again for joining us this evening. Good night. Shubharatri.
Good night. Thank you.
Cheers.
Good night.
Good night.